It's late, I know, but I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're going to talk about the first person who willingly moved to Iceland. Imagine standing on a black volcanic beach, sea salt in your beard, ash in your teeth, and realizing there's absolutely no one else around, because no one's been foolish enough to try this before. This is a story about isolation, stubbornness, and human grit, with a little moss on top. If you're listening from somewhere warm and cozy, maybe under a blanket, maybe with tea, take a second to appreciate that, because tonight's protagonist, he had rocks, and a suspiciously hostile puffin. If you enjoy this kind of quietly human history, you can subscribe, but only if it feels right. Tell me where you're listening from, or what time it is. I like to imagine the glow of this story landing softly in different corners of the world. Dim the lights and let's drift back in time. They say the first settler in Iceland was a man named Ingolfur Arnarson. But, let's be honest, he probably didn't mean to become a national myth. He probably just wanted to get away from it all, and he did. Horribly, completely, gloriously. It was sometime around 874 in the Common Era when Ingolfur, a Norwegian chieftain, decided to leave his homeland. The sagas say he had a feud. Of course he did. You don't uproot your life, abandon your social safety net, and sail across the cold North Atlantic unless someone has really, really pissed you off, or unless you're looking for tax breaks, or solitude. Or maybe just an excuse to scream into the void and not be heard by anyone for 1,000 miles. In those days, Norway was getting a little crowded. Not in the literal sense, there was still plenty of fjord to go around, but politically, things were getting tense. Harald Fairhair had started calling himself king, which didn't sit well with the many proud men who had spent their lives calling themselves noble. Chieftain, or slightly above average, Ingolfur was one of those proud men. And when Harald started unifying Norway, the unifying tended to involve quite a lot of blood, forced allegiance, and awkward sword point negotiations. So Ingolfur left. That's the short version. The longer version involves pagan rituals, drifting high seas lumber, and a suspiciously underexplained slave expedition. But we'll get to that. For now, imagine this: a ship cutting through the North Atlantic mist, heavy with supplies, hope, and just enough desperation to seem brave. At the helm, a man squinting toward a future that no one had charted yet. Wind-whipped hair, salt-bitten skin, frozen toes. His ship creaked and groaned as it neared the jagged coastline of what we now call Iceland. Back then, it had no name, just a shape in the distance, rumored by Irish monks and whispered about by Viking sailors, who claimed to have seen fire in the mountains and steam rising from the sea. They thought it might be cursed, or sacred, or both. That tracks. Honestly, Ingolfur didn't care. Or maybe he did, but by then it was too late. He had burned his bridge, possibly literally, and now the only way forward was toward the fog, the ash, and the eerie silence of a land that hadn't invited him, hadn't prepared for him, and frankly wasn't very happy to see him. When Ingolfur's ship finally scraped its way toward land, it wasn't with the triumphant fanfare of a mythic founder. There was no cheering, no horns, no flag to plant in the soil, just wind and rock, and a kind of quiet that made your ears hurt. The coast was all jagged cliffs and basalt, the kind of place that doesn't welcome you, it simply fails to kill you fast enough to make you leave. And in that failure, you begin to unpack. There's a detail the sagas don't often emphasize. Before he ever set foot on land, Ingolfur threw 2 carved wooden pillars into the sea. This was a Norse tradition. You toss the pillars, the Invegisula, the high seat posts from your ship, and let the gods guide them. Where they wash ashore, that's where you settle. It's a lovely idea. Trusting fate, letting divine forces choose your home. But here's the less poetic version. Ingolfer threw 2 carved logs into the freezing ocean, and then spent 3 years trying to find them. Because of course he did. The pillars didn't float to a nearby beach, like the gods of urban planning might have arranged. No, they drifted somewhere distant, possibly up a fjord, possibly inland, possibly eaten by a sea monster. He didn't know. So Ingolfer sent his slaves to look for them, for years, while he waited, in a temporary camp, in the Icelandic elements. This, then, is how Icelandic settlement began, with a man building temporary shelter on an uncharted coast. His entourage cold and wet and tired of chasing wood across a volcanic island in the name of theology. There's something grimly beautiful about that. Imagine waking up each day knowing that your best-case scenario is a soggy log floating toward you. That divine destiny looks, quite literally, like waterlogged timber. And yet, he waited, he built, he adapted. The sagas want us to see him as a pioneer, the first Icelander, a hero. But I wonder if he just missed home. If he woke up each morning thinking of warm hearths in Norway, familiar smells, old rivals whose insults you could at least understand. Because here, the wind doesn't talk. The volcano doesn't care. The moss is neither friend nor enemy, just clings, green and spongy, to everything. There were no trees, or very few, no neighbors. Just puffins with accusatory stares, and a landscape that looked like the moon had mated with the underworld. Still, he stayed. That's the strange part. Ingolfer didn't pack up and turn back. He didn't decide, you know what, maybe this was a bit much. He stayed, he endured. Which raises a quiet question. How bad must your life have been to look at Iceland and think, this is better? Was it really ambition that brought him here? Or exhaustion? And beneath that, was there grief? The sagas rarely speak of emotion, just actions, lineage, deeds. But I wonder what Ingolfer felt, standing at the edge of that black shore, clutching a spear with numb fingers, and realizing this was it. No turning back, no ships on the horizon, just cold, volcanic silence and the beginnings of a future no one else was mad enough to claim. He didn't conquer the land, he merely survived it, and somehow that was enough. The place where the gods finally guided those drifting pillars was a bay, not a grand bay, not a lush, fertile crescent brimming with natural resources or soft breezes, just a cold inlet surrounded by sulfuric vents and sharp hills, with a name that would later be etched into history, reluctantly It means Smoky Bay, not because it was cozy or warm or smelled like campfires. No, the smoke was steam rising ominously from hot springs and volcanic cracks. The earth literally hissed, as if warning, not welcoming. You can almost hear Ingolfer muttering, sure, this seems fine. So he built there, or rather, he began to build, a permanent settlement, piece by piece. A few dwellings, maybe a longhouse, storage for dried fish, tools for shaping driftwood, for catching what little could be caught. This was not a utopia. There were no meadows full of wheat, no herds of gentle beasts grazing under blue skies, just rocks and moss, and weather that could change moods faster than a Norse chieftain in a poetry contest. The winters were not gentle. Snow came sideways, ice clawed into everything. Fires had to be fed constantly, and even then, your toes might give up the will to participate in your future. There were no second chances out here. No neighbors to borrow from. No doctor to call. Just you. And whatever inner reason brought you here in the first place. And yet, Reykjavik took root. Slowly, painfully, like lichen growing on a stone. Archaeologists believe Ingólfur's settlement began around 874 in the Common Era. That's the date etched into Iceland's identity. The moment when human presence became permanent. When someone said, not just I arrived, but I stayed. It's easy to romanticize that kind of permanence now. But think of what it meant then. No maps, no infrastructure, no guarantee the soil would support anything more than desperation. His slaves, because yes, he brought slaves, must have looked around and questioned every decision that led them here. To build someone else's dream on a land that didn't dream at all. Even Ingólfur's wife Halveig, whose name is barely mentioned in the sagas, would have woken up each morning to a frost-covered roof, wondering if she'd live long enough to regret everything. And yet the quiet machinery of survival creaked into motion. They found ways to make food last. They learned how to shelter from the wind. They discovered which herbs wouldn't kill them, which birds could be eaten, which ones would eat them back if given the chance. They carved out a rhythm, not because they loved it, but because the alternative was dying faster. And somewhere in that rhythm, Reykjavik was born. Not with ceremony, not with a banner, just with footsteps on volcanic ash, and the decision to stay another day, and then another. Isn't that how most civilizations start? Not with glory, but with someone too stubborn nor too tired to leave. There's a particular kind of silence in Iceland, not the peaceful kind, not the relaxing mountain breeze kind that gets turned into ambient noise playlists. No, this silence is older, stranger, the kind that makes you realize just how loud your thoughts really are. Ingólfur Arnarsson would have known that silence well. Out there, far from the warmth of Norway, the air seemed to press in around you. There were no birds chirping in the trees. There were barely any trees. No hum of insects. No market chatter. Just wind. Endless wind. And the sound of your own breath fogging the inside of your fur-lined hood. The isolation wasn't just physical. It was spiritual. In the sagas, we're told that Ingólfur had a foster brother named Hialífur, who came with him. Not out of loyalty, mind you, but because, like many men of that age, he had run out of better options. Hialífur's story ends poorly, murdered by his own Irish slaves after refusing to offer them any sacrificial feasts. The usual team-building misstep. Ingólfur found the bodies later. Hialífur and his men killed in a cave, their belongings ransacked. So, Ingólfur did what a proper saga protagonist must. He hunted the rebels down and slaughtered them on a nearby island, which he named the Westman Islands, after the Westmen, that is, the Irish who had betrayed them. This was the world he lived in, where even your small circle of humans could betray you, where justice was personal, brutal, and came with an aftertaste of volcanic grief. You get the sense that by the time Ingólfur returned to Reykjavik, dragging his cold, tired soul across the rocky plains, there was less of him than when he left. The land hadn't welcomed him. His gods had been quiet. His people were dwindling. And yet, still he stayed. What kind of resolve does that take? Or maybe it wasn't resolve. Maybe it was something lonelier. A feeling we rarely name but often carry. That going back isn't an option. That you've already given too much to turn around now. That stubborn, quiet ache of commitment. We often imagine the first settlers of any land as brave, and maybe they were. But bravery wears strange clothes. Sometimes it looks like screaming into the wind. Other times, it's just the act of waking up each morning, tying your shoes, fastening your furs and choosing again to live in a place that might never love you back. Ingolfur would live out the rest of his life in Iceland. We don't know much about those years. The sagas fall silent, as they often do once the drama fades. He's remembered mostly for the beginning, for the act of arriving, not for the long, slow work of staying. But maybe that's where the real story is. Not in the ships or the pillars or the vengeance, but in the ordinary, bleak, frostbitten days that followed. The days when nothing happened except survival. A fire kept burning, a roof held, a silence shared between two people who didn't regret everything. Not quite, but sometimes came close. The funny thing about beginnings is that we rarely notice when they're happening. We imagine them grand sunrises, fanfares, lines drawn in the sand. But real beginnings are usually just ... Tuesdays, cold ones, with fish for breakfast. Again, Reykjavik, in those first years, wouldn't have looked like a capital, or even a village. More like a suggestion. A few buildings, smoke from a chimney, mud tracks where someone had walked, slowly, because walking fast meant slipping and dying. There were no streets, just paths beaten into frostbitten earth by repetition. There was no town square, no place to gather except the hearth where every sound was louder, and every silence had its own gravity. Inside those walls, stories were told, not for entertainment, but because memory was all they had. The old tales of Norway, of gods and monsters, of family trees longer than winters, of feuds that stretched generations, because vengeance was warmer than forgiveness. Maybe that's how the sagas started, not as literature, but as insulation. Outside, the wind never stopped. Snow fell not in charming flurries, but in slaps. And when it didn't snow, it rained. And when it didn't rain, the volcanoes muttered threats in their sleep. So they spoke, they remembered. They turned their loneliness into legend. And what did the land offer in return? Well, it didn't kill them. Not immediately. It offered fishol with fish, and birds, if you were quick, and moss, if you were desperate. Eventually, there were sheep and dairy. But in those first few years, Iceland offered one thing, above all, room to be forgotten. And for some, that was a gift. Back in Norway, politics had teeth. Land came with expectations. Every move you made, someone watched. Every mistake, someone remembered. But here, the land did not remember. You could disappear into it, rewrite yourself, or let the cold rewrite you. This is why, after Ingolfur, others came. They didn't come for wealth or for comfort. They came to escape feuds, taxes, kings, sins. Some were outlaws. Others were just exhausted. All of them were chasing silence, even if they didn't know it yet. Ingolfur didn't live to see Iceland thrive. There were no golden cities, no biking utopia, just farms slowly multiplying, sheep pens, hearths, children named after ancestors they'd never meet. But he had done something that few ever manage. He had gone to the edge of the world, found nothing, and said, "This will do." He wasn't a conqueror. He wasn't even especially lucky. But he was the first to make Iceland real. And in that bleak, frozen quiet, he carved out a strange kind of victory. Not the loud kind, not the kind they write songs about, the kind you whisper about, centuries later, when you're tired, when the night feels longer than usual. when you wonder if all your choices were mistakes, and if maybe, just maybe, survival is its own kind of poetry. Centuries later, when Iceland had become a patchwork of farms and families and quietly feuding chieftains, people began to look back on Ingolfur Arnason not as a man, but as an ancestor. It's what we do, isn't it? Take the uncertain and make it sacred. Turn the lonely into legend. But the truth is, he wasn't alone for long. Not in the grand sweep of time, anyway. After word spread of his settlement, others began to follow. A trickle at first, then a current. By the end of the 9th century, ship after ship found its way to Iceland's reluctant shores. Exiled men, ambitious women, entire families who had finally had enough of kings and crowns and cousins who kept borrowing their land without asking. They came from Norway, mostly, some from the Hebrides, a few from Ireland and Scotland, all of them with reasons, all of them with ghosts. And what they found was space. Harsh, brutal, punishing space, but space nonetheless. No cities, no overlords, no temples, just open land, open sky, and a silence so deep it made you wonder if the gods had followed you at all. This, of course, led to a problem. When everyone arrives, hoping to escape authority, no one really wants to create it. There was no king in Iceland, no central government, no police, just families, and land, and memory. And so, like any society stitched together by stubborn people with long knives and longer memories, they invented a solution so uniquely Icelandic it almost feels like a joke. They built a parliament in a lava field, not a city hall, not a senate chamber, a field of lava. They called it the Althing. It means, simply, the Althing, the thing where all things are discussed. Every summer, beginning around 930 in the Common Era, the people of Iceland would gather at Lyngvallara Rift Valley, carved into the earth by shifting tectonic plates, and they would talk. They'd pitch tents, trade goods, tell stories, recite laws from memory, settle disputes, drink, argue, whisper, watch. It was not democracy as we think of it, but it was something, a kind of legal theatre, a ritual of words, a way of turning memory into governance. No king, no army, just law, spoken aloud, remembered by heart, and enforced by the shared weight of community, and occasional blood feuds. Because let's be clear, this wasn't utopia. If someone wronged you, you could take them to court, but you could also take them to the woods and settle things the old-fashioned way. Justice in early Iceland was not blind. It was squinting, suspicious, and slightly drunk. But the Althing endured, and the lava listened. It still does. Even now, if you visit Lyngvallar, you can stand where they stood, a windswept stretch of moss and rock, and feel the weight of 1,000 whispered arguments echoing across the rift. A parliament without a roof, a government without a crown, born from a people who fled one king and never invited another. Imagine the scene. It's early summer in Iceland, not warm, exactly, but less freezing. The snows have pulled back like a tired sigh, revealing meadows that will briefly remember how to be green. And across the island, people begin to pack, not for war, not for harvest, for conversation. Families, farmers, warriors, law speakers, and troublemakers, everyone who mattered, and many who didn't, began the slow journey toward Lyngvallar. They traveled on horseback, by foot, with carts creaking under the weight of tents, dried meat, and grudges. So many grudges, because that's the thing no one tells you about early Icelandic governance. It was less about democracy, and more about remembering who owed you an apology and finding a public enough place to demand it. The Althing was where justice was spoken, but also where community was performed, and so people gathered. They pitched their tents around the law Rockleberg. The law speaker stood. The law speaker, not a king, not a judge, just a man with a very good memory and an even better sense of tone. He would stand on the rock and recite the law aloud, because writing it down wasn't trusted yet. Every summer, a third of the legal code was spoken, remembered, affirmed, not read, spoken. In this way, the law lived in the air, in the ears, in the mouths of the people. It was a shared act of breath, and in between the formalities, there were stories, deals struck, alliances made, marriages arranged, secrets traded in the corners of tents, feasts shared, fights started. It was like a medieval family reunion. If your family included axe-wielding farmers, and your uncle might legally challenge you to a duel over sheep grazing rights. But it worked. In its own, grim, endlessly muddy wet, worked. For centuries, Iceland remained one of the only societies in Europe without a king, without nobility, without warlords. They had blood feuds, yes, but no organized military, no standing army. Just an agreement. This place is ours, and the rules are what we say when we gather in the lava field. There's something quietly astonishing about that a society born of exile and stubbornness chose conversation over conquest, chose to remember the law instead of inscribing it in stone, chose to meet in the rift between continents and say this is where we decide who we are. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't peaceful, but it was profoundly human, flawed, fragile, and fiercely proud. And perhaps that was the point. They hadn't come to Iceland to build an empire. They had come to escape one. So they made a different kind of kingdom, one that vanished each winter, and reassembled itself each summer, like memory, like myth. Of course, not everyone came to the Althing for politics. Some came for trade, for gossip, for the chance to see someone who wasn't their cousin, to flirt under canvas shadows, or hear a new verse from a skald hood nearly frozen to death and root. It was the closest thing early Iceland had to a festival. You'd arrive dragging months of fatigue behind you, your boots cracked, your face wind-chapped, your patience low. But then you'd hear it, laughter, someone handing around smoked meat, someone retelling a saga with too much flair, someone arguing over the price of wool with the exact level of passive aggression that said, "We both know I'm right." The Althing wasn't just about law, it was about contact. In a world where isolation was default, and winters could last longer than your optimism, these summer gatherings became a lifeline. You remembered what society felt like. You saw the people you had only heard about in passing, the widow with too many goats, the outlaw who'd found religion, the chieftain whose third marriage was going even worse than the second. And in the gaps between declarations and duels, you lived. You met people, exchanged favors, heard songs, whispered secrets, fell in and out of love, or at least mutual toleration. Children ran between tents, dogs barked, someone burned their stew, someone else recited a poem about sea voyages and the ache of leaving home, and for a moment, even the lawmen paused to listen. There's a particular Icelandic word, J-E. It means people or nation, but more intimately, it means those who gather. That was the Althing, not just a parliament, a gathering, a way of being less alone, even if just for a few damp days under indifferent skies. And then, like all fragile things, it ended, not with drama, just with departure. People packed their tents, hugged those they would not see again until the next thaw, whispered final insults or apologies, depending on the year. Then began the long journey home to farms that creaked under snow, to fires that needed kindling, to silence that felt colder now for having been briefly interrupted. The owl thing didn't solve everything. Most of the time, it didn't even solve anything. But it reminded people that they weren't living alone at the edge of the world, that others were out there equally tired, equally stubborn, equally unfinished. And maybe that was enough. Because in Iceland, just knowing someone else existed was a kind of hope. Of course, not everyone played fair. This was Iceland, after all, where law and chaos walked hand in hand, sometimes stopping to glare at each other before continuing. While the Althing provided a kind of structure, it was never airtight. The law depended on memory, on performance, on reputation, and in a world without jails, enforcement was negotiable. If you won a case, the guilty party might be fined, might, if they had the means to pay or the social pressure to care. And if they didn't, well, that's where things got complicated. You could be declared full outlaw sentence, more terrifying than death in many cases. It meant you were outside the law entirely. Anyone could kill you, and no one would be punished. You had no protection, no rights. You were a ghost among the living, a shadow. There was also lesser outlawry, which lasted 3 years, a kind of mandated time out. During that period, you could survive if you stayed hidden, if you found allies, if the land didn't swallow you whole. There are stories of these men outlaws hiding in caves, sleeping under rocks, subsisting on moss and fish guts, writing poems to pass the time, going slowly mad. One such figure was Grettir Asmundarson, a hero, a villain, a tragicomedy in human form, strong as an ox, clever as a fox, and unlucky as a man in a folk tale. Grettir was cursed early in life by fate, by pride, by poor impulse control. He killed, yes, but often by accident, or necessity, or because someone else had it coming, which in Iceland was a pretty common justification. Eventually, he was declared an outlaw, full outlaw, for crimes that, in another land, might have earned community service and a stern talking to. But in Iceland, his fate was exile, and so he fled into the mountains, where he lived like a ghost for 19 long years. 19 winters, 19 springs, alone, mostly, watching the seasons turn like the pages of a saga written in frost. They say he grew paranoid. Who wouldn't? He built shelters that blended into the rocks, slept with one eye open, trusted no one, and when he did trust, he regretted it. Even his death was lonely. He was finally betrayed by a servant, ambushed by enemies who hacked him down while he slept. No grand duel, no heroic last stand. Just a man who had been outside the law so long, he'd forgotten what warmth felt like. And yet, we remember him, not because he won, but because he endured. There's a strange Icelandic pride in figures like Grettir, the ones who didn't fit, the ones who suffered, the ones who lost their place and still kept walking. Maybe because, deep down, Iceland knows what it is. A land of outlaws and misfits and soft-spoken rebels. A country born not from conquest, but from leaving. And, in that leaving, finding something no king could offer: solitude, space, and the chance to survive on your own terms, even if it kills you. But exile wasn't always physical. In early Iceland, there were other ways to be cast out, to become invisible while still standing in the center of town. You didn't need to be declared an outlaw to feel like one. You just had to be different. Take, for example, Women. In a culture obsessed with lineage, with land, with male honor and public grudges, women in Iceland had power, but always within narrow boundaries. They could own property, yes. They could divorce their husbands, and often did. But they could not speak at the all thing. They could not be law speakers. And their stories, when told, were almost always told by men. Still, some stories slip through. There's one about a woman named Under Deep-Minded, a matriarch, a widow, a voyager. When her husband and son were killed in Ireland, where they had fled after some political unpleasantness, sun did not break. She did not fold. She built a ship. Not literally, of course, she hired men to do it. But she planned it, funded it, stocked it, commanded it. She sailed from Scotland with her kin, crossed the cold North Atlantic, and arrived in Iceland, not as a passenger, as a leader. Once there, she claimed land, not just a plot, but an estate. She handed out parcels to her followers, established a dynasty, and died on her own terms. At her funeral, she was buried in a ship, not because it was tradition, but because she was the captain of her own story. Is a rare case. Most women didn't get to shape their destinies with such clarity. They worked, they endured, they survived between the lines of other people's sagas. But even in silence, they mattered. They kept the fires lit, managed the farms when their husbands rode off to court or kill, raised children in the long dark, wove the clothes, made the cheese, held the knowledge that wasn't written down but passed hand to hand, whisper to whisper. Sometimes I wonder how many sagas were edited before they were ever spoken. How many stories were shaped by the quiet shake of a head at the hearth. And how much did Iceland owe to the people who didn't speak at the Althing, but whose presence made the very idea of Iceland possible. History is strange like that. It remembers the loudest voices, the boldest moves, the men who threw axes or laws or themselves into legend. But beneath all of that, there were others, outlaws of a different kind, not by decree, but by design. Those who lived just outside the story, who carried it, supported it, kept it warm, but never got their name in the headline. And maybe that's why the sagas linger. Not because they're complete, but because we can feel what's missing. And in those quiet gaps, we see ourselves. There's a strange comfort in old things. Not because they're better, but because they've endured. And Iceland, more than most places, is a country of survivors. People, stories, stones. Even its language is old. Not just historical, but eerily unchanged. Modern Icelanders can read the sagas from 1,000 years ago as if they were written last week, albeit by someone with a flair for poetic threats and an overfenness for describing eyes as sword-sharp. Language, in Iceland, is a kind of time travel. It's not just spoken, it's inherited. Each word carried across generations, like a family heirloom, chipped at the edges, but still usable. Every sentence, a quiet act of preservation. And nowhere does this matter more than in the sagas. The sagas, not novels, not histories, something in between. They were written centuries after many of the events they describe, compiled by anonymous scribes, who had likely heard these tales, whispered by grandparents near a fire, reshaped by memory, weather, and personal bias. They're about settlers, kings, blood feuds, and ghosts. But they're also about sheep, and weather, and losing your temper in a small town with no exits. They're not heroic in the classical sense. No grand moral arcs. Just people making choices. Bad ones, sometimes funny ones, occasionally noble ones. They feel human in a way that most medieval literature does not. and they're filled with silences. Characters stare at walls, at snow, at each other. Entire years pass in a sentence. Emotion is suggested, not explored. Regret is implied, not confessed. And yet, you feel it. The weight of solitude. The ache of a missed harvest. The cold joy of revenge, followed by the realization that revenge is just loneliness with better lighting. In one saga, a man kills another over an insult so minor, modern readers would miss it entirely. In another, a woman walks into the sea after losing everything. No speech, no final scene, just water. These stories weren't written to entertain. Not really. They were written to remember. To explain why a rock is called bloodstone. Why a fjord is shaped like sorrow. Why a family line ended in silence. And for a people living at the edge of the world, surrounded by ice and fire and the ghosts of decisions made far away, memory was survival. You kept the story alive, or the world forgot you. And being forgotten, in Iceland, was the closest thing to death. Not the kind of death with a funeral and a saga to mark it, but the quiet kind. The kind where your name is never spoken again. And so they wrote, in cold script on animal skin, with ink made from soot and patience. They wrote until their hands shook, until the fire died down, until the wind reminded them that the world would go on, with or without them. But if they got the words right, maybe someone would remember, maybe someone like us. Imagine it now, a room no larger than a stable, lit by a single oil lamp, the air thick with the scent of sheep fat and ink. Outside, the wind claws at the wooden slats. Inside, a man, maybe 2 are writing. They don't speak much, not because they are solemn or scholarly, but because silence is the default here. Because the words they're copying, line by line, have already been said 1,000 times. Around hearths, between wars, over ale, through tears. And they know this isn't invention. It's transcription. Memory turned into permanence. This is how the sagas came to be. Written down not in some golden age of prosperity, but in the 12th and 13th centuries, when Iceland was already starting to fray. When the grand experiment of a stateless society was cracking under the weight of too many families with too many grudges and not enough shared meals. The Sterling era, they called it. A time of internal chaos, clan wars, betrayals. The Republic splintered. Old alliances collapsed. And the Norwegian crown watching from across the sea began to tighten its grip. So what did the Icelanders do? They wrote about the past. In the middle of their unraveling, they began to look backward, as if to say, before we forget who we were, let us remember who we thought we were. And what they remembered was deeply human. They didn't glorify their heroes. They showed them sulking, weeping, regretting, failing, winning, sometimes, but always at a cost. They told stories of men who couldn't let go of an insult, women who quietly shaped dynasties, boys who became killers, outlaws who became poets. One of the most famous of these was Angel Lorgierson, the tragic heart of the saga of Burnt Angel. He was wise, kind, peace-loving, a lawyer in the best sense of the word, someone who believed in dialogue, in reason, in the cooling of tempers. And for that, he was burned alive in his home. Not because he was wrong, but because he lived in a world that punished mercy as weakness. His death wasn't just a plot point. It was a lament, a way for the sagas to say, see, this is what happens when the fire goes unchecked, when justice becomes vengeance, when we forget how to speak before we strike. It's haunting, but it's also familiar. Because what is the saga's great lesson? beneath all the blood and frost and grief, that history repeats itself, quietly, while no one is watching, that the world turns and turns and turns. And sometimes the only power we have is to write something down before it disappears. So the scribes wrote, in rooms cold enough to crack bone, with ink that froze if they paused too long. They wrote not to entertain, but to endure, not to glorify, but to witness. And in doing so, they left behind something fragile and astonishing, a mirror held up not just to Iceland, but to us, to all of us who live with silence, with memory, with the knowledge that one day we too will vanish. All that might remain is what we've chosen to tell. If you open one of the sagas today, Nijal Saga, Egil Saga, Laxdilla Saga Yule, notice something peculiar. They begin abruptly, without preamble, without apology, just names, places, a lineage stretching backwards like a taut rope. There was a man named so-and-so, son of so-and-so, who lived at such and such a farm, and this is his story. There's no attempt to draw you in gently, no dramatic tension, no literary sparkle, and yet you keep reading, because the rhythm pulls you forward. The landscape unfolds not just the physical one of mountains and fjords, but the emotional terrain of lives lived in extreme clarity. What makes the sagas strange to modern readers isn't their age, it's their proximity. They feel close, intimate, almost uncomfortably so. There's no narrator to tell you what to feel, no moral compass provided, just people, speaking, acting, hurting, loving, failing, over and over again. One moment, someone is making a decision that will change everything. The next, they're sitting quietly by a fire, knowing they've made a mistake, but unable to undo it. That's the magic of it. The sagas don't care about heroes, they care about consequences. Even their most powerful figures are flawed, especially the powerful ones. Take Egil Skallagrimsson, poet, warrior, murderer, possibly cursed. He wrote verses as beautiful as they were bleak. He killed his first man at age 7. He wept when his sons died and turned his grief into poems that still sting today. He wasn't likable, he wasn't supposed to be, but you remember him, because in his rage and sorrow and raw, strange brilliance, he was real. That's the gift the sagas give us, not fantasy, not escapism, but recognition. They whisper, yes, people have always been like this, complicated, noble, petty, afraid. And maybe that's why they've lasted. Not because they're perfect stories, but because they're true ones, emotionally, if not always factually. They teach us that history isn't grand, it's granular, built of quarrels over grazing land, of whispered insults at feasts, of eyes meeting across smoky halls with meanings we'll never fully decode. And in the stillness of those old vellum pages, there's something else, too. A sense of time folding in on itself. Because when you read the sagas, you're not just reading about Iceland. You're sitting beside someone cold and tired, and a little amused by how ridiculous humans are and still rooting for them anyway. Someone who knew what it meant to be alone, and wrote so that you wouldn't have to be. Not tonight, not entirely. There's a moment in Laxdilla Saga, quiet one, easily missed. A woman named Gu, Rune Svifrstetta, sits by a river and tells her story. She has been married 4 times. She has buried lovers, made enemies, crossed emotional fault lines that most of us would avoid even in dreams. And yet, she does not speak with bitterness. She speaks with memory, weighted and worn. Someone asks her, near the end of her life, which of her husbands she loved the most. Her answer is not what you expect. She says, "To him I was worst, whom I loved best." That's it. 8 words. No elaboration, no footnote. Just that. To him I was worst, whom I loved best. A confession. A heartbreak. A life's worth of contradictions wrapped into a single sentence. It's one of the most famous lines in Icelandic literature. Not because it's dramatic, but because it isn't. Because it tells the truth quietly and lets you decide what to feel. This is the kind of emotional logic the sagas trade in. Not declarations, but revelations. Not plot twists, but gently turning mirrors. And as they unfold over fires, across centuries, they do something remarkable. They make space for contradiction. People in the sagas can be noble and foolish, brave and cruel, faithful and faithless, often within the same page. There are no saints, no devils, just humans, trying to make sense of the cold, the wind, and each other, and the land, always the land. In saga after saga, the landscape is not backdrop, its character. The fjords are brooding, the rivers bite, the mountains judge you. The snow decides who lives and who doesn't. Even the light has a personality. Summer sun that forgets to set. Winter dark that swallows time. To live in Iceland was to live in negotiation with the elements. And the sagas, for all their legal tangles and family trees, never forget that. Nature is always there, looming, indifferent. It does not take sides. It simply waits. So when characters in these stories act trashly, heroically, violently, it's never in a vacuum. They act against a backdrop of stone and silence. And the reader, even now, feels it pressing in. The cold, the loneliness, the strange kind of clarity that comes from standing at the edge of the known world and realizing you are very small. And yet, still, your story matters, because someone told it, and someone listened, and someone, maybe, will remember. In the end, the sagas aren't about victory. Not really. Few people win. Some survive. Most endure. And even those who seem to triumph few outlive their enemies. Who claim land, who have songs sung in their name, rarely find peace. Because peace, in the sagas, isn't something you're granted. It's something you choose, often too late. That's what makes them different from the heroic epics of elsewhere. There's no final battle to prove your worth. No divine reward for your virtue. Just the slow, aching weight of consequence. A man kills another man over an insult. That man's son waits 10 years, then kills in return. The cycle continues. Generations bleed into one another. At some point, someone pauses and asks, why? But by then, it's too late. The tide has already turned, and beneath it all, the land watches, silent, unmoved. The sagas don't offer moral clarity. They offer recognition. You read them and think, yes, that's how people are, proud, petty, brave, fragile, and unbearably tired. You read about lovers torn apart by timing, friends undone by pride, families split by silence, and every line feels like a whisper from someone who's been where you are. The sagas were not meant to comfort, but they do, in their own way, not by softening the truth, but by sitting with it, by saying, you are not alone in your confusion. Your grief has been felt before. Your questions are older than language, and sometimes that's enough. To know that in a farmhouse 1,000 years ago, someone stared into the fire and wondered if they had ruined everything. To know that another person watched the snow fall and thought, will this ever end? To feel that across time, across oceans, across languages, someone wrote it down. so that one day, in the quiet of your own night, you could read it, or hear it, or simply feel less alone. Because stories, in the end, are not about the past. They are about persistence. A way of saying, we were here, we felt these things, we left them for you. And if you're listening now, maybe tired, maybe sad, maybe just trying to fall asleep, know this. So many of them felt the same, and still they spoke, and still they stayed. The world has a way of folding in on itself. For centuries, Iceland was left alone, not entirely, but enough. Tucked away in the North Atlantic, surrounded by fog, whispered about in foreign courts as a place of myth and monks and madness. A land of fire and ice and far too many poets. And then, the outside world came knocking. It always does. In the 13th century, after decades of internal strife, the clan feuds, the bloodletting, the political marriages, gone spectacularly wrong, Iceland finally bent, not to war, but to exhaustion. The chieftains, weary of constant fighting, looked to Norway and said, in essence, fine, rule us, just ... Please handle the paperwork. And so the island was absorbed, quietly, first by Norway, then, centuries later, by Denmark. And like that, Iceland became a possession, an afterthought, a name on a ledger. No more Althing as a sovereign body. No more republic, however fragile, just a cold, rocky province run from far away. There were no invasions, no burning cities, just slow erosion. And that's somehow sadder, isn't it? To lose your independence, not with a scream, but with a shrug. The sagas had already been written, the great poems already carved into skin and stone. The last of the skalds, those poet-historians who once wielded words like swords, began to fade into silence. And for the next few hundred years, Iceland drifted. Politically, culturally, spiritually, it remained stubborn, of course. Icelanders are nothing if not durable. But they were no longer the unruly, axe-swinging ghost clan of old. They were now farmers, fishermen, clergy, quiet survivors, and the land, well, it didn't change. The mountains still brooded, the lava still muttered, the winters still came earlier than anyone wanted to admit, but the sense of being a people at the edge of the world alone, self-contained, mythically, began to soften. Other stories crept in, Danish laws, European fashions, imported Christianity with its cathedrals and saints and uncomfortable chairs. The old gods Thor, Odin, Freya, were replaced by the new one, not by violence, but by conversion that was, like so much else in Iceland, oddly pragmatic. The Althing voted. Yes, voted. In the year 1000. And just like that, Iceland became Christian, not because of divine visions or holy wars, but because it seemed like the politically savvy thing to do at the time. And yet, even as they bowed to foreign kings and foreign creeds, the people remembered. They kept the sagas. They whispered the old names. They passed on stories with eyes that said, we believe in one God now, of course. But let me tell you what happened at the base of Helgafell one winter, long ago, because Iceland never forgot how to be a story. And in doing so, it never fully disappeared. History doesn't always roar forward. Sometimes it limps. For Iceland, the centuries after losing its independence were not filled with drama. They were filled with weather, with waiting, with slow, quiet suffering. The Middle Ages came and went. The Renaissance bloomed elsewhere. Wars raged across Europe. Empires expanded. And Iceland endured. Its towns stayed small. Its farms stayed poor. Its people lived close to the bone, nursing what little the land gave them, and making up the difference with story, song, and a particularly refined sense of sarcasm. Even their misfortunes became legend. There were the volcanic eruptions, blackened skies and poisoned pastures. There were the famine seas, when even moss seemed like a luxury. There were the plagues won in the early 15th century that killed half the population in a matter of months. Iceland did not get many diseases, but when they came like wolves. And through it all, there was the wind. It has been said, possibly by someone snowblind and furious, that Iceland's most enduring feature is its weather's refusal to behave. Rain that moves sideways, snow that feels personal, sunlight that appears just long enough to remind you what you're missing. People didn't live in Iceland because it was easy. They lived there because it was theirs. They clung to their farms like barnacles to a rock, and the rock, in turn, did not soften. But it also didn't forget, because even in these long, hard centuries, when the sagas had become quaint, and the world had turned its attention elsewhere, Iceland remembered its stories. Children learned to read, not because it was fashionable, but because it was vital. Books were heirlooms. Literacy wasn't a luxury, it was a survival tool. The winters were too long, too dark, too isolating not to have something to read. And so the tradition continued, not always formally, not always accurately, but faithfully. Fathers told their sons about Egil Skallagrimsson and his ungovernable rage. Grandmothers whispered, "Gu Runes, bitter love." Farmers remembered the outlaw Grettir, who once hid near here, just past that ridge. The stories became part of the landscape. Not metaphorically, literally. You can still go to those places. You can visit the valley where someone was ambushed, the farmstead where a feud began, the beach where Ingolfur Espelars may be washed ashore. The sagas are mapped, named, woven into the earth, because Iceland, perhaps more than any other nation, treats its fiction like fact and its facts like poetry. It doesn't argue with history, it listens to it. And in that listening, something strange and rare happens. Time doesn't vanish, it lingers, so that even now, on a cold, modern evening, you might look up from your dinner table, glance out the window toward a hill you've seen your whole life, and think, that's where they buried the body, just before the snow. But even in a land of stories, not every tale gets told. There are whole centuries in Iceland's history where the records grow thin years, where it feels like nothing happened, or perhaps everything happened too quietly to be written down. No sagas, no legends, just seasons, grain that wouldn't grow, sheep that wandered off cliffs, children who didn't survive the winter. These were the centuries of patience, of anonymity, of survival without spectacle. And yet, they shaped Iceland more than any battle or verse ever did. The people who lived through these years weren't heroes. They were maintenance workers for history, the quiet custodians of continuity. They mended roofs, repaired boats, dug graves. They counted days by the weight of their coats, by how long it took the butter to freeze, by which relative had scurvy this time, and somehow they kept going. Why? That's the question, isn't it? Why stay in a place that punishes you for waking up? Why not leave? Sail south, start again. Some did. Of course they did. But many stayed. Maybe because leaving would mean forgetting. And forgetting, to an Icelander, is a fate worse than hardship. The land was hard, but it was theirs, and it remembered them. Every ridge and stone held a name. Every path was a footstep, repeating an older one. To abandon it would be to sever the story, and in a culture where story is identity, That was unthinkable. So they stayed, and they adapted. When fish stocks shifted, they changed their diets. When trade routes failed, they became more self-reliant. When lava swallowed their farms, they moved to the next ridge and planted again. There's something quietly radical about that kind of stubbornness. It's not the heroism of grand gestures, it's the heroism of maintenance, of enduring day after day in a place that doesn't particularly care if you're there. And in doing so, they wrote a different kind of saga. Not one of war, but of weather. Not one of kings, but of kitchens. Not one of destiny, but of domestic survival. The kind of saga that doesn't end with applause, but with a sigh and the clinking of a pot on the hearth. These stories are harder to trace. They don't have names attached. They don't get carved into stone or reprinted in glossy editions. But they matter, because they are the reason anything remains. Every great myth stands on the shoulders of someone who just kept going. Every hero owes their saga to 100 unnamed figures who fed the fire, patched the roof, and made sure there was still a world to come home to. And in Iceland, perhaps more than anywhere else, those figures are never truly forgotten, because every stone still whispers their names, even if no one wrote them down. To live in Iceland was to negotiate constantly with the elements, with the past, with your own expectations. But the strangest negotiations were with time itself. Because here, time didn't flow the way it does elsewhere. It stalled, looped, dug its heels into the mud and refused to be rushed. There were winters where nothing changed, where the days blurred together in a fog of firewood and frozen breath. And then, suddenly, a year of eruptions, or floods, or sheep diseases with names so strange they sounded made up. And through it all, time kept one secret close. It would always outlast you. This is perhaps why Icelanders became so good at waiting. They waited for the thaw, for the trade ship, for the storm to pass, for the law to be read, for the fish to return, for the next page to be written. Even today, there's a phrase, wetter reddest. It means, roughly, it will work out. Not because it always does, but because, eventually, something happens, and that's usually good enough. This wasn't optimism, exactly. It was a kind of bone-deep endurance, the belief that no matter how strange, or slow, or sharp the days might be, they would pass. The world might tilt. The volcano might whisper threats in the night. The king might forget your name, but the wind would still blow, and you'd still be here, waiting, enduring, writing it down. And in time, all those moments of quiet survival added up to something larger than any single tale. A culture. Not the kind of culture that conquers or colonizes, but the kind that knows how to make soup from nothing. The kind that can find joy in a single sunny day after 47 grey ones. The kind that doesn't fear the long silence, because it knows that, eventually, someone will speak. And maybe that's why Iceland, despite all its hardships, never quite crumbled, because it didn't need noise to survive. It needed memory. And it had memory in spades, passed not just in books, but in hands. In songs sung while spinning wool, in phrases muttered during sheep roundups, in stories told in the pauses between storms. Stories not just of gods and monsters, but of neighbors. Of that one guy who married a ghost. Of the cousin who always milked the cows too early. Of the woman who once told death to come back later. She wasn't done with her knitting. These were the sagas, too. Smaller, stranger, softer. The kind that don't make it into history books, but do make it into the way a person pauses before opening the door. Or the way someone watches the sky before lighting the lamp. Because even now, Icelanders carry their stories like fire. quietly, carefully, so the wind doesn't blow them out. There's a glacier in the center of Iceland called Langbikel. It means long glacier, which is exactly the kind of practical poetry the Icelandic language excels at. No flourish, just fact. It sits there massive, ancient, unmoved, like a sleeping god no one prays to anymore. And near its edge, not far from the ridges that still remember Ingolf's first footsteps, there is silence, not the absence of noise, the presence of stillness. The kind of silence that makes you wonder if sound has simply given up. In that silence, if you stay long enough, something strange happens. You begin to hear things, not voices, not ghosts, but weight. The weight of memory, pressing gently from all sides. The kind of weight that reminds you you are small, temporary, and yet somehow included. Because Iceland never asked to be a metaphor, but it became one anyway. A place that refuses to be easy, that doesn't care if you're comfortable, that doesn't try to impress you, that dares you to leave on, then dares you to come back. It's a land that shrugs at your ambition and hands you a shovel. It says, you want to survive here. Good. Here's some wind, some ash, and a story about a man who lost 3 toes and still made the best smoked lamb in the valley. And maybe that's what the sagas were always trying to say. Not that life is grand, but that it is strange and unfolding and worth recording even when it seems impossibly small. That even the bleakest landscape can hold meaning. That even the most forgettable person might be remembered if only by a rock, or a name, or a crooked fence post no one ever got around to straightening. So much of Iceland's story is about not being seen, and yet here we are, still looking, still reading the old words, still walking the old paths, still asking the same quiet questions. What makes a life matter? What happens after the saga ends? What if this moment, this one, right now, with the kettle just about to boil and the rain scratching softly at the windows, is the whole point? And maybe it is, because in the end, the story of Iceland isn't about discovery or conquest or even survival. It's about attention, about noticing the tiny warmth of a fire in the cold, about knowing that moss takes centuries to grow and stepping carefully because of it, about remembering the names of people who died in silent sand, saying them gently so they echo a little longer, so that the wind doesn't take them to by the time the modern world arrived. Trains, telegraphs, treatise Iceland was still catching its breath. It was no longer independent, no longer the feral republic born of stubborn exiles. It was, officially, a Danish territory, politely managed, mildly neglected, mostly forgotten. The kind of place cartographers remembered only when the sea froze thick enough to strand a boat. But beneath that quiet, something was stirring. Not rebellion, not yet. Something older, slower, a pulse, because Iceland had not forgotten itself. It still had its language unchanged, unbent, beautifully strange. It still had its stories kept warm in the mouths of grandmothers and read aloud by candlelight to children who didn't realize how old the words really were. And it still had its silence, which is a kind of strength if you know how to use it. In the 19th century, the world began to shrink. Steamships crossed oceans, telegraph wires stitched nations together, empires rose and fell with a new kind of speed. And Iceland, cold, volcanic, perennially inconvenient, began to ask a question. What if we wanted to matter again? Not loudly, not violently, just enough to write our own endings. It started, as it often does, with poetry. The rimmer, those haunting, rhythmic verse cycles, part lullaby, part lamentive, evolved into a nationalist heartbeat. Writers emerged, scholars, farmers who spoke Latin, clergy who dreamed of independence, and slowly the sagas came alive, again not as nostalgia, but as identity. People began to remember who they had been, not just a colony, not just an afterthought, but a culture. And as Europe flexed and fractured, Iceland looked inward. It looked at its sheep, its students, its silence, and said, "We're still here." By 1874, Iceland was granted a constitution by the Danish king, a small gesture, but meaningful, like a door cracked open in a long-sealed house. By 1918, it became a sovereign state still tied to Denmark, but now its own. And in 1944, while the world was tearing itself apart in war, Iceland stepped quietly into independence. No revolution, no fire, just a vote, an overwhelming yes. And so, on a rainy June day, the Republic was reborn nearly 1,000 years after Ingolfur first saw smoke rising from a bay he hadn't planned to love. It wasn't dramatic, but it was deeply, deeply Icelandic. Because here, beginnings often look like endings, and freedom doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just waits, and when the time is right, it nods, and it begins again. You might expect fireworks, some grand declaration, flags waving, crowds roaring, but Iceland, true to form, greeted independence with something quieter, something steadier. Rain, on June 17th, 1944, the day the Republic of Iceland was officially declared, the skies over Lingvalla wept. Not a storm, not a downpour, just that soft, persistent kind of rain that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The kind that soaks into your bones without ever raising its voice. The kind that feels like memory. And perhaps it was fitting, because Lingvalla, where the old thing had once stood, where laws had been spoken into wind for centuries, was more than just a location. It was a witness, a rift valley formed by tectonic plates always drifting apart, a literal scar in the earth. And into that scar, Iceland poured its history. People gathered, some in wool, some in uniforms, some with tears on their cheeks, though no one could tell in the rain. A Danish flag was lowered, an Icelandic one rose, and with it something settled, not triumph, not vengeance, just a long, quiet exhale. Imagine what it must have felt like to be there, to stand on ground your ancestors had walked 1,000 years ago, speaking words you could still understand, and know that now, finally, no one else would write your story, that it was yours again, yours to keep, to ruin, to cherish. And yet, even in that moment of rebirth, there was no arrogance, no boasts, no grandiose speeches, because Icelanders understand something many nations forget. Independence is not a finish line, it's a burden, a responsibility, a slow, steady flame that must be fed, not fanned. In the decades that followed, Iceland built itself anew, but never from scratch, always from memory. The sagas were not just literature now. They were constitution, curriculum, character. They reminded people of what it meant to belong to a land that did not flatter you, that did not soften for you, that asked you to earn your place every day with care and grit and the occasional sarcastic poem. And so they did. They rebuilt schools, established banks, modernized their fishing fleets. But they also kept the sheep, the old turf houses, the weathered churches, the names that still sound like verses from another time. Because Iceland's greatest gift has never been power. It's been continuity, that soft thread stretching from Ingolfur's first winter, through the sagas, through centuries of fog and famine, all the way to that rain-soaked afternoon in 1944, a thread held carefully, passed hand to hand, heart to heart, so that even now, when a child learns to read, their first stories are not imported, they are inherited. Of course, independence didn't change the weather. The lava still bubbled in its sleep. The sheep still wandered into places they shouldn't. And Reykjavik, the smoky bay once settled by accident and divine driftwood, began to hum with a new kind of energy, not loud, not rushed, but insistent. There were buildings to raise, roads to carve, a future to write, and slowly the island adapted again. Electricity made its quiet arrival, not everywhere at once, but enough to change how people moved through the dark. Books were printed in warm-lit rooms instead of copied by frostbitten fingers. Roads connected once isolated farms. The isolation that had defined the Icelandic soul began to shift, not vanish, but loosen its grip. Planes came, tourists, money, and with them, questions. How do you modernize without forgetting? How do you open your doors without losing what made you build them in the first place? These aren't just Icelandic questions, of course, but here they felt sharper, starker. The country had only just remembered how to be itself. Now the world wanted inmot, and not just the world, nature, too. Because Iceland is not a place that tolerates stillness for long. The land moves, it breathes, sometimes it explodes. Volcanoes have no interest in your plans. They do not care about holidays, or harvests, or headlines. When they want to speak, they do. In 2010, the world was reminded of this when a volcano with a name no Icelander could pronounce, Eyjafjallajökull, erupted with a kind of poetic indifference. Ash filled the skies. Flights were cancelled across Europe. News anchors stumbled over syllables. The planet briefly looked north and remembered, oh, right, ... Iceland. And Iceland just shrugged. Not with smugness, with familiarity. Because this wasn't new. Not to them. This was the old language. The island speaking in fire. A reminder that they were guests here. Always had been. Always would be. That even with independence, with airports and streaming services and Wi-Fi in the fjords, the earth could still say, not today. And so the people waited. Cleared ash from rooftops. Adjusted. Recalculated. Because if the sagas taught anything, it's that nothing is stable. Not even land. Especially not land. What matters is how you respond. You dig, you listen. You carry the silence with reverence, not fear. And you keep the story going, not because it's easy, but because it's yours. In the years that followed, the world began to notice Iceland for different reasons. It was no longer just the home of unpronounceable volcanoes and literary ghosts. It became a place of curiosity, of wonder, of unexpected relevance. A financial crisis in 2008 hit Iceland hard, catastrophically hard. The banks collapsed. Currency unraveled. The country's entire economy felt like a house built on ice, suddenly realizing the temperature was rising. But Iceland responded the only way it knew how, with stubbornness, with storytelling, with the eerie calm of a people who had survived worse centuries of famine, plague, ash, betrayal, cold, and the slow ache of being forgotten. A financial collapse, please. This was a country that once survived by eating boiled lichen and turning sheep bladders into art. So they faced it. They arrested bankers, restructured debt, protested with kitchenware. Literally, pots and pans became a symbol of the people's anger. The so-called kitchenware revolution filled the streets of Reykjavik with the sound of clanging metal and quiet fury, And somehow they emerged, not unscathed, but unbroken, because that's the Icelandic way. You endure, you adapt, and then you write a folk song about it. In the years that followed, something else happened, something soft but remarkable. People began to arrive, not just tourists with cameras and puffin hats, writers, artists, musicians, people who felt like they didn't fit anywhere else, people tired of noise, of speed, of cities that screamed without saying anything. They came to Iceland looking for something older, quieter, stranger, and they found it. They found a country where silence still had depth, where darkness didn't mean fear, where stories were kept alive not in museums, but in conversations, in place names, in glances. Some stayed, others just listened, but all of them carried something back with them, a kind of slowness, a sense that maybe not everything has to be so loud, so immediate, so relentlessly new, that maybe there is value in the old, in the cracked, in the patient, that maybe, just maybe, the world has something to learn from a place where time moves like lava slow, hot, inevitable, and if you listen carefully, the story still tells itself. In the wind against the cliffs, in the steam rising from the hot springs, in the way the moss grows, slow, deliberate, ancient, it says, we're still here. We remember, and that remembering ... is enough. It's strange, isn't it? How a place once known for its isolation, its silence, its distance from everything became, in the end, a kind of refuge. Not just for the birds and glaciers and sulfur-scented springs, but for people. People who had grown tired of noise, of cities where you forget your own name in the crowd, of lives too fast to feel. They come to Iceland not to be entertained, but to listen, to pause. And Iceland, in its strange, windswept way, receives them, not with warmth, not at first, but with presence. It offers its cliffs, its storms, its stories. It makes no promises. It asks for patience. It does not flatter. But if you stay long enough, if you learn how to listen, you start to understand that this land is not barren. It's distilled, not empty, essential. You begin to notice the small things, the way sheep dot the hills like punctuation marks in a sentence the earth hasn't finished writing, the way the language bends around place names, holding memory in every syllable, the way people speak softly here, not because they're shy but because they know the wind is always listening, and in that quiet, something begins to settle. The ache you carried, whatever form it took, ... lighter, not gone, just ... shareable. Because Iceland has known ache longer than most. It has known what it means to be alone, to be forgotten, to be at the mercy of things beyond your control. And yet, it never gave up its story. It never let the silence win. And maybe that's the quiet miracle of this place. Not the northern lights, not the geysers, not the lava fields, or the black sand beaches, or even the lingering ghosts of Viking poets, but the fact that, after everything, it still believes in stories, still hands them down, still offers them to strangers who arrive cold, tired, and a little bit lost, because it knows, sometimes, all you need to begin again is a place where you're allowed to stop. If you ask an Icelander today where they're from, they won't say a city. They'll say a place, a farm, maybe, a fjord, a valley with a name that sounds like a spell, a stretch of land where their great-grandmother was born, and where the sheep still ignore fences with quiet, generational contempt. This is not sentimentality, this is orientation, because in Iceland, you don't just live in the land, you live with it. The sagas understood this. They didn't just describe people, they described where those people were in excruciating, loving detail. She lived at Logabrekka, west of the river, near the slope that faces the sea. Not because it mattered to the plot, but because it mattered to the truth. You were not just a character, you were a coordinate. And that sense of place, that near-sacred attachment to geography still runs deep. Even today, in an age of Google Maps and airport layovers, Icelanders can trace their lineage like rivers. They know who came from where, who crossed which fjord in which century, who claimed land after a feud, who married the daughter of the man who once insulted the wrong sheep farmer and had to move 3 valleys away to avoid getting disinvited from everything. It's all still there, not in textbooks. In conversation, in the casual way someone points to a mountain and says, "That's where my grandfather got lost once, in the fog, and swore he heard a voice that wasn't his own." In the way someone walks a familiar path and pauses not because they're tired, but because they remember who used to walk it with them. This connection is not always gentle. The land demands attention. You don't hike in Iceland without preparation. You don't cross rivers lightly. You don't build a house without first asking if the Huldafolk, the hidden people, might object. Yes, really. Because here, belief is less about doctrine and more about respect. Respect for what you can't see, for what you can't control, for what has been here longer than you. In many ways, Iceland is still medieval. Not in technology, but in temperament. In its reverence for weather, for memory, for the thin veil between the seen and the unseen. And in that way, it remains quietly, stubbornly sacred. Not in the way of cathedrals and incense, but in the way of moss, of mountains, of wind that knows your name before you speak. And then there are the elves, not the twinkly-winged kind, not the Tolkien kind either. The Icelandic Huldafolk, the hidden people, are quieter than that, older, not quite visible, not quite imaginary, something in between. Ask an Icelander if they believe in them, and you'll rarely get a straight yes or no. Instead, you'll get a shrug, a smirk, a pause. "It's not that I believe," they'll say, "but I won't build a road through their hill." And they mean it, because belief in Iceland isn't about certainty, it's about possibility. And in a land where the ground steams, the earth splits, and entire mountains disappear into clouds for weeks at a time, who's to say what's real? There are stories, many stories of construction projects halted or rerouted entirely to avoid disturbing elf homes, hills considered sacred, rocks that shouldn't be moved, entire boulders left untouched on the edge of highways because someone, somewhere, got sick after they tried to relocate one. And even if you laugh, even if you call it superstition, the road still curves, because the land has a memory, not just of people, but of rules. And one of those rules is simple. Don't assume you know everything. Don't assume that just because you can't see something, it isn't there. It's a kind of humility rare in the modern world, and deeply Icelandic. It's the same humility that accepts the sea might take your boat, that the mountain might not let you pass, that the weather might undo all your plans, and that sometimes the best response is to go home, make soup, and wait. It's a mindset forged by centuries of uncertainty, of knowing that survival doesn't come from dominance, but from relationship, with the land, with each other, with the stories you've inherited. So the hidden people are not just folklore, they're etiquette. A way of remembering that not everything in the world is for you, that some paths are meant to be walked around, not through, that some silences should be respected, and whether they live in mossy hills or in the soft part of your imagination doesn't really matter. They exist because they've been spoken. And in Iceland, to speak something is to give it a kind of life. The sagas knew this, the poets knew it, the builders and farmers and stargazers all knew words are not decoration, they're anchors. So even now, when the world feels flat and fast and far too loud, you can go to a hill in Iceland, just a hill, and find someone who says, quietly, I wouldn't dig there, and you'll believe them, or at least you'll understand why they do. There's a certain honesty to a place where the earth still moves beneath your feet. Iceland sits on a fault line literally. The North American and Eurasian tectonic plates pull apart here, inch by inch, each year. It's not metaphor, it's geology. The land is cracking, always, and yet people stay, not in denial, but in awareness. It's something that hums beneath daily life. A quiet understanding that nothing is stable. That permanence is a myth. That the ground you're walking on was molten not that long ago, and might be again. There's humility in that, and maybe even comfort. Because if the earth itself is unfinished, then maybe you don't have to be either. Maybe your grief doesn't need to resolve. Maybe your failures aren't final. Maybe your story is allowed to wander, to shake, to fracture, to change. Iceland doesn't just accept instability, builds with it. The homes are low, the roofs are steep, the walls are thick. The foundations are not bravado, they are compromise. Even the churches, those fragile symbols of belief, are small, bowed by weather, tucked into hillsides like apologies. There is beauty in their restraint, in the way nothing here tries to outshine the landscape. Because how could you? How could you compete with a sky that forgets to darken for weeks? With glaciers that sing as they melt? With volcanoes that sleep like gods and wake like fury? You don't. You fit yourself into it. You match your breath to the wind. You dress in layers. You say little, and you mean all of it. And in return, the land teaches you something precious. That it's okay not to be in control. That awe is not fear. That silence is not absence. Iceland doesn't give you meaning. It gives you context. It says, you are small, but not forgotten. You are temporary, but not pointless. You are cold, maybe, but you are here. And that, and this rock, in this wind, under these stars, enough. You learn, eventually, not to fight the seasons. In Iceland, winter isn't something that comes and goes, it's something that settles. Like an old relative, one who shows up early, stays too long, and doesn't care if you had other plans. It arrives in October, sometimes September. Grey skies folding over the mountains like a tired shrug. Snow that doesn't shout, just accumulates, quietly, persistently, layer by layer, until the world forgets its color. The darkness creeps in, too. Slowly at first, a missing hour. Then another. Then, suddenly, it's 3 p.m. and the sun is already packing its things. For months, the light hovers low. A sideways glow that never quite becomes warmth. The sky turns indigo before dinner. Some days it never turns blue at all. And yet, life continues. Children walk to school with reflectors sewn into their coats. Candles flicker in every window. Books pile up. Soup simmers. Time thickens. People check in on each other, not because it's polite, but because it's necessary. Loneliness in Iceland is not romantic, it's dangerous. A thing to be respected, like the sea, or the old roads that vanish beneath snowdrifts. So they stay close, they read, they knit. They bake things with cardamom and pass down stories that can only be told when there's nowhere else to go. They call it Jolobo Kafla, The Christmas book flood. Each December, Icelanders give each other books. Then they spend the night reading, wrapped in blankets, surrounded by silence. The kind that holds you, not the kind that swallows you. It's a tradition, yes, but also a kind of resistance. A way of saying, we will not be dimmed by this dark. We will fill it with words, with warmth, with each other, and it works. Because even the bleakest winters end. Slowly, the light returns, the snow retreats. The days stretch out like someone remembering how to breathe. You begin to notice color again. The red of a roof, the green of moss, the pink smudge of sunlight against ice. And with that color comes motion. Water starts to run. Birds return. The silence shifts from heavy to holy. And you remember, this place is not just about surviving the dark. It's about recognizing that light, when it comes, is never guaranteed, which makes it worth everything. Spring in Iceland isn't a season. It's a rumor, a suggestion whispered by the wind, then swiftly contradicted by sleet. You'll hear birds brave, uncertain birds trying out their voices against a sky that hasn't quite decided what it wants to be. The snow melts, but only out of boredom, and somewhere in a crack between rocks, moss thickens, not blooming, just enduring harder. That's the Icelandic spring. No daffodils, no sudden warmth, just a shift in tone, a different kind of silence. One that says, you made it. Not with applause, but with a nod. The lambs come next, wobbling into a world that still feels too raw, too unfinished. Their bleats are high-pitched, confused like they weren't expecting this to be life. But Iceland is like that. You arrive thinking you're in a fairy tale. You stay because you found something better, truth. A truth with calloused hands and wind-burned cheeks. A truth that feeds you when it can, and asks nothing more than your attention. And as the days stretch minute by minute, hour by hour, you find yourself stretching, too. Not reaching for anything, just expanding, thawing, letting yourself feel the space around you. Because Iceland gives you space. Not just physical space, though it has plenty of that. Valleys where you can walk for hours without hearing another voice, cliffs that stare into the ocean without blinking. But emotional space, too. Permission to be quiet, to be tired, to not know, to sit with your unfinishedness and call it something like peace. And that might be the softest, strangest gift this land offers. The chance to stop performing, to just be, messy, thoughtful, weather-worn, a little sad, maybe, but real. And if you listen, really listen, you'll notice something in the wind. Not a voice, not a message, just a rhythm. The same one that pulsed in the feet of the first settler, hauling driftwood up a slope. The same one that moved through the mouth of a poet, shaping grief into verse. The same one that hums beneath moss, beneath stone, beneath every line of every saga that was ever spoken just to keep the dark from winning. It's still there, waiting, not for an answer, just for someone to stay long enough to hear it. There's a particular kind of grief that lives in old places. Not sharp, not loud, just settled. It gathers in corners, in doorways, in stones smoothed by hands that no longer exist. In Iceland, that grief is not buried. It's worn, not like a burden, but like a coat passed down through generations, patched, familiar, strangely warm. This is a land that remembers its dead, not through monuments, but through names. Everything here has one. Mountains, valleys, rocks barely taller than your knees. Ask an Icelander where they're from, and they might answer with a name that no longer appears on maps, but one that lives in their mouth like a song. Because in Iceland, naming is a form of resurrection. To speak something is to keep it from vanishing. That's why the sagas matter, not just for what they tell, but for what they preserve. A story about a feud over sheep isn't just a story, it's a thread, a way of holding on to the face of someone long gone, a reminder that they were real, that they mattered, that their life, however small or strange, left a mark. And Iceland is full of those marks. Cairns marking paths no one walks anymore. Ruins of turf houses leaning into the earth like tired thoughts. Churchyards where the wind remembers hymns even when no one else does. Even the language grieves in its own way. There are words here with no clean translation. Words like gluggaver, window weather, which describes the kind of day that looks beautiful from inside, but punishes you the moment you step into it. Or Leikis, not just national theatre, but a place where a nation remembers itself through performance. Or Av, Rhea Veterant, to endure the winter, not to fight it, not to conquer it, just to endure. Because sometimes that's all you can do. And Iceland knows that. It doesn't ask you to heal. It simply offers you a chair by the fire, a bowl of something warm, and a story that begins with a name and ends with silence. And in between grief, yes, but also laughter. Because grief, in Iceland, is not the opposite of joy. It's the condition for it. A soft reminder that everything ends, and that the ending is not failure, it's just part of the song. So you learn to listen for it, not with your ears, with your presence. And when you hear it, when the wind carries something just familiar, enough to feel like a memory, you don't try to hold it. You just nod and keep walking. There's a church on a hill in Iceland, white against the dark slope, where the wind never quite stops moving. It isn't grand, no stained glass, no towering steeple, just wood and stone and the faint scent of old hymns. It faces the sea, not because it's symbolic, but because everything in Iceland faces the sea, eventually. The ocean is less a border and more a constant. It brings weather, it takes sheep, it holds stories that never make it back to shore. For centuries, it was both savior and executioner, the source of food, of passage, of ruin. Every village has stories of ships that never returned, of men lost in fog so thick it might as well have been myth. And yet they kept sailing, because what choice was there? You sail or you starve. You trust the horizon even when it lies, and you teach your children to do the same. Even now, with GPS and heated cabins, Icelandic sailors bless their boats, not out of superstition, but out of memory, because the sea doesn't forget, and neither do they. You can still find fishermen who speak of the water like an old lover, dangerous, beautiful, not to be trusted, but deeply, deeply known. They'll tell you of storms that came too fast, of silence that descended like a hand, of moments when they looked out and felt, for one long second, that the sea was watching them. And they're not wrong. There's something in that vastness, not malice, not kindness, just presence, and it changes you. There's an Icelandic saying, Avi vera ashonum, to be at sea. It doesn't just mean fishing, it means being unmoored, vulnerable, caught between one thing and the next. It's a state of being, a condition, and maybe we all feel it sometimes, drifting, trying to steer by stars we no longer believe in, looking for land, for something solid. And Iceland, this strange, stubborn island, offers no promises, only this, that others have drifted before you, that they survived, that their stories are still here, clinging to rocks, whispered by waves, held in the salt-stiff pages of a saga no one reads anymore, but everyone remembers. And maybe that's enough, to know that you're not alone out there, that someone else has been at sea and came home. Every country tells itself a story. Sometimes it's loud, glorious, all flags and drums and declarations. But Iceland's story is quieter. It's not about conquest, or even victory. It's about staying. Staying when the land froze your fingers, when the volcanoes woke hungry, when your livestock drowned and your children nearly did. It's about choosing to remain when logic said leave, and doing it again the next day, and the next. This isn't the kind of narrative that gets carved into marble. It doesn't fit neatly into textbooks or national anthems. It lives, instead, in lullabies and lava fields, in the names of places no one visits, but everyone can pronounce, in the way your grandmother still reads the weather like a priest reads scripture. It's a story of persistence, but not in the modern, motivational sense. Not the kind that says you can do anything. No. It's the kind that says, you probably can't, but you can continue. You can walk through the fog. You can milk the cow in the storm. You can write the poem no one will read because it matters to you. You can stay, even when staying feels absurd. And if you do it long enough, the absurdity turns into something else. It becomes home. Iceland didn't become Iceland because of destiny. It became Iceland because people kept choosing it, over and over again, choosing the cold, the dark, the silence, and finding hidden in all of that not despair, but depth. There is something in that kind of loyalty, that kind of daily, unglamorous courage. It's the opposite of romance, and yet it is the most romantic thing imaginable. To say, I will love this place, even when it doesn't love me back, even when it forgets me, even when it hurts, because it's mine, and because it remembers me in its own way, not with statues, but with paths, worn into the earth by feet that once hesitated, and then moved forward anyway. Somewhere on the West Fjords, where the cliffs drop into the sea like the edge of a forgotten thought, there's a bench. It doesn't have a plaque. It doesn't need one. It faces the water, faces the nothing. And when you sit on it, time slips. The wind doesn't whistle its sighs. The ocean below murmurs to itself. There's a rhythm to it all, but no beat. Just that long, breathless stretch between things. You start to feel it. The slow unfolding of everything you've ever tried to outpace. Grief, memory, longing, questions you never answered, and the silence that grew around them. Out there, nothing competes for your attention. There are no signs, no must-see spots, just moss and sky and stone. And in that absence, something opens. Maybe it's your chest, maybe it's your memory. Maybe it's the part of you that forgot how to be still. This is what Iceland gives when it gives. Not beauty, though it has that. Not wonder, though it leaks out of the cracks. But permission to stop narrating your life. To let the unfinished things stay unfinished. To feel the weight of your ancestors, not as pressure, but as presence. Because they're here, you know that, don't you? Not in ghosts or statues or stories carved in runes, but in the way your feet land on this soil, in the way your breath changes as you step into the cold, in the way the air tastes like salt and thyme. And if you sit there long enough, on that nameless bench overlooking nothing in particular, you might find a strange kind of peace, not because everything makes sense, but because it no longer needs to. Iceland has already answered the question for you. You are not here to conquer. You are here to witness, to listen, to remember what silence can hold when you stop trying to fill it. There's an old Icelandic word, Skenora. It means longing, but not just any longing. A specific kind, deep, low. A yearning for something that may never return or may never have existed at all. It's not loud. It doesn't shout or demand. It sits quietly in the chest. It looks out windows. It stirs when the wind shifts. It listens for footsteps that aren't coming. In Iceland, Skenora is not a weakness. It's a companion. It's the part of you that remembers what the world has taken and still manages to be grateful for what's left. Maybe that's why so many Icelandic songs sound like weather. They don't build to crescendos. They drift. They ache. They wait. Just like the land. Just like the people. Just like the stories. Because here, even joy is braided with sorrow. Not out of tragedy, but out of truth. To live is to miss something. Someone. Some version of yourself that only existed for a moment, long ago, in light that no longer comes quite the same way through the window. And still there is beauty, not the kind that overwhelms, the kind that endures. A single candle on a winter table, the curve of a hill where a house once stood, a name whispered into the steam of a geothermal bath. Iceland does not chase happiness. It does not perform peace. It simply allows you to be tired, to be uncertain, to be full of schooner, and still wake up each day and tie your boots anyway, because the wind won't wait, and the path, however quiet, is still yours to walk. The thing about silence is it has layers. There's the silence of a snowfall, soft, suspended, almost maternal. There's the silence of a lava field, dry, absolute, the kind that stares back. And then there's the silence of waiting. Iceland is fluent in all of them. For a millennium, it waited to be found. Then it waited to be remembered. Then it waited to be understood. But maybe understanding was never the point. Maybe Iceland was never meant to be decoded or conquered or summarized in a travel brochure. Maybe it was meant to be witnessed. And maybe that's enough. Because the truth is, you don't visit Iceland. You encounter it. You arrive thinking it's a place. And you leave knowing it's a presence. Not something you pass through, but something that passes through you. You notice it when you're back home, weeks later, standing in your kitchen. The quiet feels different now. It has weight. Or when the wind picks up unexpectedly, and your chest aches not from the cold, but from the memory of a place that never once pretended to be warm. You'll find yourself remembering things you didn't mean to memorize. The way the light scraped across a glacier at 2 a.m., the sound your boots made on volcanic gravel, the feeling of being so far from everything, you stopped needing anything. And what Iceland gave you, in return, was not onot exactly. It was perspective. A gentle reminder that you are temporary, that your sadness, your longing, your hopes, they are weather. And like all weather, they pass. But also like weather, they shape the landscape. So you begin to see your life differently, not as a list of accomplishments, but as a geography of feeling. Places where you broke, places where you healed, valleys of rest, mountains of decision, rivers of change, and through it all a thread, a story yours. Fragile, maybe, quiet, definitely, but still unfolding. It's easy to forget that Iceland is still young, geologically speaking. A baby, really. A wild, tantrum-prone island, still finding its shape. New land is born here literally. Underwater eruptions rise up, cool into basalt, and offer a fresh canvas. Sometimes it lasts, sometimes the ocean reclaims it. Either way, the world changes, and yet human history here runs deep. There are places where the past lies only a few inches below the soil, where a new building project unearths a medieval longhouse, where farmers plough fields that once hosted duels, where schoolchildren learn poetry older than most nations. That's the paradox of Iceland, always becoming, never forgetting. There's something sacred in that balance. A nation not obsessed with preserving the past as a museum, but living alongside it, side by side, in the same kitchen, the same prayer, the same footstep. This isn't nostalgia. It's continuity. The sense that even as the world spins faster, you don't have to. That it's okay to walk, to linger, to plant your hands in volcanic soil and say, I don't need to reinvent everything. Some things were made well enough. And what Iceland does so quietly, so stubbornly, is insist that culture can be a form of care. Not just what you create, but what you protect. The language, with its long, curling words. The sheep, bred for endurance and wary eyes. The knitting patterns passed through generations, thread by thoughtful thread. And maybe most importantly, the silence, protected not as a lack, but as a presence, something that asks for your respect, because in that silence, something grows. Understanding, maybe, or just rest. And in a world that praises speed and volume and noise, maybe rest is the rarest act of resistance. So Iceland resists, with quiet, with memory, with the knowledge that when the land shakes sand, it will shake you. Do not run, you stand, and you listen. There's a word in Icelandic, kirk. It means stillness. Not just the absence of movement, but the presence of calm. The kind of stillness that settles into the bones, that echoes in your chest long after the sound has faded. You don't find Keurig in cities. You find it at the edge. At the end of a gravel road, where the tires stop and the landscape begins. Where there are no signs, no fences, just wind and the long, low murmur of the earth remembering itself. It's not a peace you earn. It's a peace that arrives when you stop trying. Iceland teaches you that, if you let it. It teaches you that the world is not here to impress you, that mountains don't care if you photograph them, that waterfalls don't need your admiration to keep falling, that silence doesn't require your interpretation. It just is. And in that being, there is room. Room to breathe. To feel small, yes, but also included. Because this land, in all its quiet wildness, makes space for you. Not to prove anything, but to return to some part of yourself that remembers how to be still, how to listen without answering, how to stand in the cold and not rush back inside. You might feel it while watching the fog drift across a plain where nothing moves, or while lying on your back on warm summer grass, listening to the wind tangle itself in the long dry stalks, or in the brief hush after a story is told, and everyone, without knowing why, goes silent. That's Keurig. And it's not a destination. It's a rhythm. A way of being in the world that doesn't demand attention, but notices. It notices the color of the sky at 11 p.m. in July, the sound of sleet hitting the same window every morning in February, the way a horse turns its head when the wind changes. And once you learn to notice too, you carry that stillness with you, even when you leave. Especially then. There's a question Iceland asks you, though it never says it out loud. It doesn't arrive as thunder. It arrives in the pause between things, between waves, between footsteps, between words you're not sure how to translate. The question is this: what, exactly, are you in such a hurry to become? It's not mocking, it's not even curious, it's just present. And in that presence, you feel something shift, not dramatically, just slightly. like the loosening of a knot you didn't know was there. Because the world beyond Iceland, bright, fast, always speaking, asks you to chase. Chase more, chase better, chase louder. But here, the chase ends. Not in failure, in refusal. Iceland does not ask you to prove your worth. It does not require your productivity, your profile, your plan. It simply says, be. Be cold if you must. Be quiet if you can. Be lost if that's where you are. But whatever you are, be it fully. Stand in the rain without checking your phone. Walk without purpose. Eat something warm without apology. Sleep early. Wake slowly. Leave things unfinished. Let yourself be unfinished. Because the mountain doesn't rush its shape. The lava doesn't hurry to cool. The sheep do not strategize their next move. They are, and that is enough. And perhaps, in this strange stillness, you begin to remember a version of yourself you'd almost abandoned. Not the polished one, not the productive one, but the one who watched clouds and gave them names. The one who paused before stepping onto ice, not out of fear but respect. The one who understood, without knowing why, that some places are not meant to be conquered, only visited, only felt, only carried, later, when the noise returns. And when it does, when the world rushes back in, with all its need and noise and neon urgency, you will still have this. The way the sky arched over you without comment. The taste of salt in the air. The story you were told, once, by a stranger who looked out at the sea and whispered, "It's always been like this." You may never be able to explain what changed, only that something did. There are stories that end, and then there are stories that settle, that drift down like ash, covering everything softly, that don't demand resolution, but ask only to be remembered. Iceland is that kind of story. It doesn't tie itself in bows. It doesn't end with fireworks. It ends the way twilight does, slowly, quietly, and with the sense that maybe it hasn't ended at all, just turned into something else. Because this isn't a place that concludes. It continues. In moss that outlives memory. In sheep paths that retrace old griefs. In the way the language curls around silence like a scarf around a throat. Here, even the wind sounds older than the wind anywhere else. And maybe that's the point. Not to know, but to stay a little longer. To listen again to the same story, told slightly differently. To feel the same cold, and find that this time it doesn't bite, it clarifies. To walk the same path, and notice the stone that wasn't there before, or maybe was, and you just weren't ready to see it. Iceland doesn't change for you, but it changes you. Not with drama, with depth. You return home different, not louder, not brighter, but stiller, a little more weathered, a little more real, like someone who has heard something ancient and chosen, quietly, to carry it. And when the noise of the world grows loud again, as it will, you'll find, buried somewhere deep inside, a silence that doesn't break, a coastline that doesn't erode, a story that doesn't end, only pauses, like this one. There's a stretch of road in the south of Iceland where the landscape forgets how to be kind. It's just black, flat, wind-stripped, ash-haunted, the sea on one side, too wide to name. The mountains on the other, too far to reach, and in between a ribbon of road that stretches into a kind of beautiful nowhere. No trees, no towns, no noise, just space. And that space changes you. At first, you try to fill it. You speak, you point, you take pictures. Then, slowly, the words dry up. The camera hangs heavy. You stop pointing because there's no one to point to. Just the wind and the road and the sense that something is unraveling inside you, and it's not scary, it's necessary. It's you returning to scale, because in most of the world, we walk too tall. We are the protagonists, the algorithms, the content creators. Every day is a performance, a pitch, a loop. But out here, in this black silence, there is no audience, there is no plot. There is only the long, low sound of tires against gravel, and the realization that you do not need to be exceptional. You need to be honest. And Iceland has a way of asking for that, not through confrontation, through exposure. You can't hide here, not from the wind, not from the cold, and certainly not from yourself. So the layers peel back, slowly, softly, not all at once, but enough. Enough to feel the ache you've been numbing. Enough to hear the voice you buried beneath busyness. Enough to finally ask the question that's been sitting in your chest like a stone. Is this all I am? And the answer is both smaller and greater than you expected. Yes and no. You are moss and mountain. You are ocean and error. You are the brief breath of steam rising from cracked earth on a frostbitten morning. And you are more than enough. This road doesn't promise revelation. It offers reflection, not answers, space. And maybe that's what you needed all along. Not to be found, but to unfold, to loosen the grip, to let the silence in, to trust that not every chapter needs a climax, some just need to continue. And as you drive that empty road between ash and sky, between beginning and not quite ending, you realize you don't need to arrive. You just need to stay with the story for one more mile, one more minute, one more line. You begin to notice the shapes of things, not just the mountains, but how they lean, not just the wind, but how it folds around your body like a second skin, not just the silence, but the tone of it. It's not empty, it's listening. Out here, the land doesn't just exist. Watches, not with malice, not even with interest, but with the calm, constant attention of something that was here long before you and will be here long after. And yet, it includes you, not as a guest, not as an intruder, as a presence, as another living thing, small and unremarkable, but necessary in some quiet way. And that changes how you move. You stop rushing, you stop explaining, you stop curating your experience into shareable pieces. Instead, you begin to receive the color of wet basalt, the slow drip of snowmelt, the way a raven's wings sound like paper being torn gently. Each moment lands, not as stimulus, but as scripture, and something in you says, this is the real thing, not the real you. That doesn't matter so much anymore. The real world, unpolished, unfiltered, unconcerned with your schedule, just here, breathing, and welcoming you into that breath. There's a term Icelanders sometimes use, via, are. It doesn't translate cleanly. It means to be in peace, but not the political kind. Not the kind you chase with spa music or self-help books. It's a state, a stillness. To be in awe is to be inside your life, instead of racing ahead of it. To stand at the edge of a fjord, with your hands in your pockets and no plan, and realize this is what presence feels like. And presence, once tasted, is addictive, not because it's thrilling, but because it's true. And truth, out here, is elemental. It is the cold on your teeth, the ache in your legs, the shadow of a cloud moving across a field of lupins, as if it has somewhere to be but isn't in a hurry. And you follow, not because you're lost, but because you've finally stopped pretending to know the way. Eventually, the road gives out, not suddenly, It just fades into gravel, then dust, then a footpath where only sheep and memories seem to walk. And so, you walked not because you know what you're looking for, but because your body, softened by stillness, begins to move towards something. The path rises gently through fields that were never truly fields, just stretches of ground too stubborn to be tamed, moss over stone, wind-worn grass, the occasional rusted fence post tilting like an old man's hat. And then, without warning, you come to the edge, not of the land exactly, but of time. Below you, a fjord, so still it reflects the sky with unnerving precision. Around you, cliffs, cragged and silent, like teeth from a sleeping giant. And behind you, everything you thought you needed to be. There's no one here, no cars, no phone signal, no distraction, just breath. And the slow realization that this isn't a view, it's an invitation to grieve, if you must. Not loudly, but completely. To remember the people who are going not with despair, but with company. To speak their names into the wind, knowing it will not echo them back, but it will hold them. Because the land listens. It always has. And here, at the edge, you realize that Iceland isn't beautiful in the way the world usually means. It's not pretty, it's true. It doesn't ask for anything. It doesn't promise anything. But it lets you be raw, confused, tender, unfinished. It lets you cry without performance. It lets you laugh without purpose. It lets you stand for as long as you need and say nothing at all. And when you finally turn to leave, not because you're ready, but because the light is starting to shift you, don't say goodbye. You just nod, as if to a companion. Because Iceland is not a place you visit, it's a place that visits you, and it stays, in the way you pause before interrupting, in the way you speak someone's name more softly than you used to, in the way you now understand that solitude isn't emptiness, it's depth, and you carry that with you, wherever you go. Eventually, you come back down from the cliff, not to leave, but to return, to the world you thought you knew, to your suitcase, your schedule, the life you'd temporarily set aside, like a coat you forgot you were wearing. Only now, it fits differently, because you do, and no one will notice, not right away. You'll speak as you always have, smile when expected, nod in meetings, laugh in elevators. But somewhere beneath the surface, something has shifted, not broken, unlatched, as if a door inside you opened, just slightly, and now the wind moves through. You don't rush to close it, because Iceland taught you not to fear the draft, that a little cold in the bones can remind you you're alive, that emptiness isn't always loss, it can be room, room to feel, room to listen, room to forget, gently, what never mattered, and to remember, quietly, what always did. And so you begin to live a little differently. You pause before answering. You watch the clouds with a new kind of reverence. You say I don't know more often, not as defeat, but as truth. You read slower, you love slower, you mourn slower. Because you understand now, slowness is not laziness, it is attention. And attention, in a world designed to scatter you, is an act of devotion. You begin to treat your own life the way Iceland treats its language, with care, with patience, and with a soft refusal to rush, because rushing misses things. It skips over the moss. It forgets the way grief pools in quiet corners. It talks over the part of you that hasn't spoken in years. And Iceland listens. Not because it wants to fix you, but because it remembers what you forgot. That some stories are meant to unfold, not be told, not be sold, just unfold, like steam over stone, like a shadow across snow, like the slow, steady breath of someone who stopped running and started returning. You never quite leave Iceland. Not entirely. It becomes part of the architecture of your quiet moments. In the pauses between sentences, in the hush just before sleep, in the ache behind your ribs when you smell something that reminds you of cold air and wet wool and something older than you'll ever understand. You don't tell people this, not because it's a secret, because it can't be explained. Not in words, not really. You could try, of course. You could talk about the fjords and the waterfalls and the moss so thick it feels like memory underfoot. You could mention the way people look you in the eye when they speak, or how even the sheep seem like they're keeping old stories in their bones. But it would sound too poetic, too abstract, too much. So instead, you say something like, "It's beautiful," and let that be enough. Because those who know, know, and those who don't, maybe they will. Someday, maybe they'll go. Maybe they'll listen. Maybe they'll stand on the same road, in the same wind, and feel something fall away, not loss, exactly, but excess. And maybe, if they're quiet enough, they'll hear what you heard. The breath of a land that doesn't need you to love it, just to witness it, to be present, to be small, to be, briefly, part of something that doesn't care who you are, and yet includes you anyway. And that's the miracle, isn't it? That in a world spinning too fast to notice itself, there is a place where noticing is the sacred act, where the land asks only that you see it, and in doing so, teaches you how to see yourself, not as a project, not as a brand, not even as a story, but as a person, quiet, incomplete, still walking, still listening, and that is enough. That has always been enough. There's a little house near the northern edge of Iceland, red roof, white walls, crooked chimney. It sits alone, not far from the sea, with nothing behind it but sky. No sign, no history book entry, just a door that opens, sometimes, to let in the wind. People say it belonged to a fisherman once, or maybe a poet, or someone who was both. But no one knows for sure, and maybe that's better, because places like that unclaimed, unproven hold a different kind of truth. Not the documented kind, the felt kind. You stand before it and feel, for reasons you can't explain, the need to lower your voice, to take off your gloves, to touch the doorframe lightly, as if saying, "I see you." And in return, the house seems to nod, not welcoming, not unfriendly, just aware. You sit on the step, you let the wind find your collar, you watch the clouds, you say nothing, and in that nothing, something fills. Not peace, exactly, not clarity, but belonging. The sense that you have arrived somewhere not in geography, but in time. A time before noise, before pressure, before the need to prove. Here, no one asks what you do, or what you want to be. The house doesn't care. The sea doesn't care. The hills behind you are too busy holding snow to ask questions. So you're left with yourself, not the curated self, the real one, the version that stares into the distance without thinking, that hums old songs under breath, that grieves things it never got to say, and still hopes, quietly, for softness. And that version, it's been waiting, not for a moment of crisis, for a moment of stillness. This is that moment, a step, a breath, a house that might be abandoned or might be sacred depending on how you enter. And all it asks is that you pause. Not forever, just long enough to notice. The door is slightly ajar, the sea is still speaking, and the wind, for once, is not against you, it's beside you. You don't take a picture, not this time. You reach for your phone, almost by instinct, but your hand stops mid-motion. Not out of principle, out of presence. There's nothing to capture here that could survive the translation. A photo would flatten it, make it consumable. And this moment, this hushed, open breath, moment refuses to be consumed. It can only be lived. And so, you live it. You sit with it. The cold leaks through your coat and into your bones, but you don't move. The silence grows thicker, not heavy, just complete. A kind of fullness that doesn't require sound. You don't think about the next place, or the return flight, or the life that waits for you with blinking lights and unanswered messages. You just breathe, and in that breath, something breaks, quietly, like a thaw, like a door, long sealed, easing open on its own. It's not dramatic, it's not cinematic, it's just real. Something in you tight, tired, tangled gives up its grip. Not in surrender, in relief, and you feel it. Finally, you don't need to be fixed. You don't need to be better, or brighter, or more. You don't even need to understand why you came here in the first place. You only need to be here now, as you are, with the wind in your ears and the sea at your feet and the old red-roofed house behind you watching, maybe, or just standing. And you realize this place, this whole strange island, never asked for your worship, only your witness. It doesn't perform. It doesn't apologize. It endures. And in doing so, it invites you to do the same. Not heroically, just honestly. And that is something rare, something holy, something you won't explain to anyone, not because you can't, but because you won't. Some things are meant to be carried, not shared, and this you will carry, forever. Eventually, you rise, not because you're finished, but because the light has changed. That soft, northern tilt of the sun reminding you that time still passes, here I then, in stillness. And so, with hands half numb and thoughts half formed, you begin the walk back. It's quieter now, somehow. Or maybe you are. You notice things differently. The bend of the grass under your boots. The way the horizon doesn't end, it just forgets to begin again. Every step feels like a sentence in a language you're only just beginning to learn. You don't look back at the house. You don't need to. It's already part of you now, like the scent of sea salt on wool, like a lullaby heard in a dream, like a place that isn't home, but held something you once lost there. And as you walk, you begin to think about how Iceland holds memory, not with monuments, with landscapes. Every hill a footnote, every path a sentence half erased by snow, every rock a witness to something nobody else remembers, and yet, somehow, it remains. That's what you are now, too. A witness. To what, exactly, you couldn't say. To the breath of the earth, maybe. To a kind of quiet that doesn't empty you, it restores. You realize now, the trip was never about seeing Iceland. It was about being seen by it, letting it look at you, through you, past the persona, past the plans, until all that was left was the person beneath it all. The version of you that didn't need to arrive, just to return. And as the road unwinds and the wind picks up again, you find yourself whispering something into the open air. A thank you, maybe, or a name, or just a sound, meant for no one, offered to the vast, kind silence that gave you back to yourself. And if the land hears it tanned, you feel, somehow, that it doesn't reply, it just holds it, and lets you go. You drive back in the dark, not the oppressive dark of cities, with their neon bruises on the night, but the velvet kind. The old dark, the kind of dark that has depth, that doesn't swallow you, but wraps you. Outside the car window, The world is reduced to suggestion, the outline of a hill, the glint of ice, the blur of something possibly alive or possibly imagined. You keep the headlights low, not because you can't see, because you want to feel. Each curve in the road is a memory, each bump a punctuation mark in a sentence the land is still writing. And you begin to understand something else now. This wasn't an escape. It was a return to a rhythm you forgot you once knew. Before calendars, before ambition, before the part of you that needed proof. Back when you could sit in silence without checking your reflection in someone else's eyes. Back when presence wasn't a practice, it was your natural state. And now, even as the miles slip by, you carry that rhythm with you. It lingers in the way you grip the wheel, not tight, but aware, in the way your breath slows, not forced, just honest, and in the way you feel a softness toward your own exhaustion. The part of you that used to ache for meaning, now just aches. And that's okay, because Iceland didn't solve you, it held you, in its silence, in its stones, in its deeply unremarkable, unforgettable hours. And somewhere along the way, you stopped asking what you were supposed to find. You just found a bench, a house, a version of yourself that didn't need to speak to be understood. And that version rides with you now, not as a passenger, as a presence, softer, still unfinished, but whole, in a way you didn't know you were allowed to be. And finally, the airport, fluorescent lights, announcements that don't need to be heard, the smell of coffee and tiredness and something vaguely synthetic. You return to the rhythm of departure, passports, gates, waiting areas full of half-unpacked strangers, scrolling and sipping and saying things that don't quite matter. You are one of them now, and yet you're not. You stand in line, but your mind is still on the hill, on the silence, on the house that might not even exist on any map but lives now in the architecture of your sleep. Your hands still smell faintly of cold metal. Your heart still moves with the rhythm of wind. Someone nearby is laughing too loud. You don't mind. Someone else is rushing. You don't follow. Instead, you move through the space slowly, not to make a point, just because that's how your body wants to move now. Unrushed, attentive, like someone who knows what time is and isn't afraid of it. And as you sit by the gate, waiting to be called, you pull a small notebook from your coat pocket, one you forgot you packed, and without quite knowing why, you write one word, not a name, not a poem, just a word, still, and that's the whole truth, isn't it? Not that Iceland changed you, but that it reminded you who you were before the noise, before the world asked you to be so loud just to feel seen, before ambition whispered that you were only worthy if you ran. And now you know better. Stillness isn't absence, it's presence deepened, and you carry it with you, not like luggage, like breath. And when they call your flight, you rise, quiet, unfinished, real, still. Thank you for staying with me. Whether you drifted off halfway through, or listened all the way to the end, I'm glad you were here. It's a quiet kind of miracle, really, that across all this noise, you found your way to this story, and stayed a while. If these slow, strange histories speak to something in you, you're always welcome back. You can subscribe if you'd like to hear more. No pressure, just a soft invitation. And if you feel like it, let me know where you're listening from, or what time it is, or what part made you feel a little less alone. Until next time, take care of yourself, sleep well, and good night.